All right, so well, welcome guys again. We have a new student with us, Miss Rampol. Um, Ferdina, is it? Is that how it's pronounced? Miss Rampol? Ferdina Rampol. Anyway, she's a student who's nearing completion of the early childhood care program that she's doing. So congratulations to her and welcome on board. I'll have a chat with her afterwards about her scheduling in relation to the assignments that we have for the courses for this program. All right, so let's get started here with chapter two. And primarily in chapter two, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looking at the evolution of well, the current issues facing leadership and ethics, or leadership in particular, and we are also going to look at the evolution of the theories of leadership and how they emerged during the period, well, during during its development. All right. So to begin with, if we look at the current situation or current observations about leadership. So again, we're going to be looking at people contributing ideas and making their observations as we move along. All right. So for a lot of people, what we find happening is that positions of leadership are often viewed as something to be achieved. That's why they're perceived as a prized or coveted phenomenon in our society. Because it speaks to status, and status is something that we speak about in terms of self-actualization. Now, because not everybody ends up in positions of leadership, leaders themselves are obviously some people are liked by those with whom they operate or work with, and of course some people hate them. So at the end of the day, the whole situation is one where it's half a dozen of one, six of the other kind of situation in terms of how people respond to leadership and leaders themselves. Now, interestingly enough, according to Mr. Burns in 1978, its leadership is one of the most observed phenomenons, but it's the least understood. And the reason why it's not so easily understood is because people's response to leadership is so varied, and people look at it differently, and that creates problems in terms of how how developed the whole particular situation is going to be. Now, what we're going to notice is that a lot of work has gone in, especially in the last 20 years or so, in terms of development of various programs that have arisen or grown up in industry, in particular with leadership in business and management activities, but also general leadership in terms of uh, various programs that look at self-leadership and self-development. So you'd notice that these are just some textbooks from some of the more leading programs that you might have seen. I'm not sure if any of you all ever participated in any of these. One here, the leadership experience from DAFT, is one of the textbooks that we're utilizing from the course. So that's something that you could look at. I have actually done the Stephen Covey's program, and I did another one which I'm not seeing here, which I don't have, called the Leadership Challenge, that came out of West Virginia University. Somebody who you might be accustomed to seeing on TED Talks and stuff like that is a guy called Tony Robbins. He's one of those speakers that motivational type speakers who speaks to about the development of self leadership and self, as you can see, unleash the power within. Those are the kind of things. Any of you all ever participated in any of these, any kind of leadership program in the past? No? All
No,
right.
sir.
All right, cool. Let's move on then. All right. So the social construct of leadership makes it very difficult for any one definition to exist because, as we said, different people see leadership differently from every particular angle, and that leads to us having difficulty in trying to define it, and that creates problems for us to be able to design programs to study it and to develop and work out training for it. This is especially affected when we start to look at it from an international perspective, um, uh, because different places and different cultures look at leadership in different manners. So Eastern culture, for example, leaders are very revered, whereas in Western culture, leaders are oftentimes, looked upon with a very skeptical view. All right. So how do you all feel about leadership as a particular question that you need to be looking at and challenging yourself with in terms of asking asking yourself about your position in terms of that. Now, when we have Josiah's on his way in. Hi, Josiah. Welcome. Um, so when we look for leaders or we look at leadership, one of the biggest things that we look for leaders to do is to help us deal with the problems that we face around us today. I've listed some here: climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services critical to basic survival. Josiah having issues. Welcome back, Josiah. Seem to be having some issues. Do you have any other thing that you would like, concerns that you think are important for us to identify here, in terms of what we would like our leaders to treat with? Anybody can think of anything, especially here in Trinidad, for example. Any ideas? No?
What about crime?
Crime, right? Crime, so that would be crime and security, national safety. That's an interesting one, yes. We recently had, how do you all feel, for example, of the emergence of I think it would be our first female commissioner of police? How do you all feel about that?
So I didn't hear anything about that.
Really? So
Yeah.
the proposed individual coming into power is a lady, and people are looking at supporting it. It hasn't been, what's the word I want to use, confirmed yet, but she's an um, acting commissioner at this point in time. So I guess we can see whether or not her approach to things would be any significantly different to the previous leadership techniques that we saw, and whether or not they will actually help us to deal with the issues that we have in terms of our concern for crime and criminal activity. Now, the problem with that, though, is that oftentimes when people arrive in positions of leadership, they don't really, for one reason or another, they fail to perform, and it leads us to being disappointed with them. And as a result of that disappointment, we behave in a very negative way towards them. We show them a lot of distrust and disrespect, and that creates something in the environment called that the text refers to as the anti-leadership vaccine, because it means therefore that because leadership becomes such what was the word I want to use? I want to use the word, well, they use the description here, difficult and frustrating experience. It discourages people who would probably make good leaders from actually wanting to be considered for that leadership position because of the way in which society in general responds to people and responds to individuals as leaders, especially if the leaders are struggling to find solutions to very complicated issues that our society is facing. And we judge people very quickly and we judge them very harshly, and it creates an issue as I said, the anti-leadership vaccine, where now people who would have probably made the better leaders don't want to put themselves up to this type of abuse, and that then leads to the types of individuals getting into leadership positions being those who are probably not necessarily the best bet or best fit that would have worked in our society. And that, unfortunately, is the reality that we find ourselves um, facing in our current situation. We can look at this in particular with politics. I know that there's a lot of people who you might know from a personal point of view who you might think would make a better political leader or representative for your area. But the people who end up running will be those people who have thicker skins, who can manage um, and are willing to take all the abuse that comes with the situation. But they're not necessarily going to be the individuals who have the better ideas or who have better solutions or who are intelligent enough to be able to think in a different way or think outside the box to be able to find creative solutions to the types of problems that we're having. That's something that I've noticed a lot, and that is a direct response to people who are, uh, reluctant to get involved with leadership because of the difficult circumstances they find themselves facing. Now, because of the amount of research that has been done um, in leadership, a lot of the myths about leadership we can start to dispel, and we could start to try and put them into a list that we could look at here for this classroom. Um, and one of the most important things that comes up from it is that when we try to explain and define leadership, we have to put it in the context in which it's being practiced, because the nature and type of leadership that is practiced in in a classroom or in an office is different to the type of leadership that you will find taking place in a social or community type activity or movement, as the case is here. Because you'd find that in a classroom or an office, the person is usually given in a leadership position, is usually in a position of authority because of their position in the organization. So, for example, in a classroom, the teacher is generally considered to be the leader, and that is so because of their position and role that they function in. Similarly, with a manager or CEO. But in terms of a social movement, a leader emerges as somebody who's a champion of a cause, and that champion arrives in that position, and the techniques that they have to utilize to motivate people to want to move forward with the ideas that they have is going to be different to the techniques that are going to be utilized in classes or office spaces or management positions. So let's look at some of these myths that they talk about. So the myths are: leaders are born, not made. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold formal positions or have status to be and power to be considered a leader. You must have charisma to be a leader, an effective leader. There is one standard way of leading. It is impossible to be a manager and a leader at the same time, and you only need to have common sense to be an effective leader. So these are some of the myths that we have. Let's look at what the research tells us about these things. The first one is that leaders are made, not born. Many people have capacity to lead, but they themselves can't lead because they lack the skills necessary for that, and therefore the concept of leaders being born is something that we have to try and put aside. Leaders aren't born with characteristics and genetic skills that make them leaders. They are born just like everybody else, and the environment that the person comes up in, as well as the the learning that takes place during their lifespan, are the things that develop leadership skills. And therefore, if that's the case, then everybody has the potential to become leaders because they can be influenced not only by the environment but also by training and development. So that myth about leaders are born, not made is incorrect. Leadership occurs at all levels of organization. Now, if you work in an organization that has a whole um, triangular sort of pyramid structure, what this technique is telling us is that leadership is not only resident at the upper end of the organization, but that leaders can exist throughout an organization, even among your peers, because it means that what you're doing is you are taking up leadership responsibilities, although you may not necessarily have the the status or the leadership or the position to be a leader in the organization from a formal sense, but you are leading others to do better and be better by probably through your example and through your own motivational techniques that you're utilizing in the organization. So much so that a lot of organizations are starting to push towards flattening their organizational structure so that it allows for that type of natural leadership development to come up in the organization, and therefore they want to try to empower more people throughout the organization to lead through example and lead through their actions and motivation. This leads to a stronger organization because if you have people at all levels taking leadership positions, it creates a situation where the organization becomes stronger because they have such a strong backbone in terms of people who are willing to take responsibility for the outcomes and the objectives of the organization. This is especially so in social movements where you have different elements that have to operate together, different arms of the organization that have to operate. So you need to have multiple leadership individuals operating throughout the organization to help push complicated ideas or complicated social movements forward. All right, so charisma is not a prerequisite of leadership. So charisma is a very dangerous thing because charisma is not so much about the leader themselves, but it is about the impact that the leader has on people. And that impact is emotional and very subjective in nature. As we say in Trinidad, your blood either take somebody or do take somebody kind of situation. And that type of problem that comes up is or charismatic response is problematic in the sense that it usually attaches itself to some form of emotional response which can create problems because um, charismatic leaders, though there have been a good number of them who have done good things, a lot of charismatic leaders have actually done a lot of negative things. So, for instance, Drucker here speaks about three charismatic leaders in the past century: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. And what was really important about these three guys is that they inflicted some of the most suffering on the human race than any other leaders in history. And they were all looked upon as being highly charismatic people. And that's the danger of charisma when it comes to leadership, because you start off by appealing to people's emotional response. They get connected and emotionally connected and emotionally invested in that person. And then after a while, logic kind of stops dictating things. So let's look at a couple of charismatic leaders. Now, we've met a few of these in the previous chapter. So we have Adolf Hitler there. I guess most of you all can recognize him. That's this gentleman in the upper left-hand corner. The lower right-hand corner, we have Martin Luther King. We met him in a different thing. We talked about him. These are, well, obviously, Hitler is negative in terms of his charismatic influence or the influence of his charismatic leadership, whereas Martin Luther King is a positive force that worked, and his charisma was utilized to move the civil rights movement in the United States. Mahatma Gandhi. Now, depending upon where you sit on in the world, you may look upon Mahatma Gandhi as being a good or negative, but he used charisma to move India from a position of colonial rule to independence. But during the period, he was also partially responsible for India and Pakistan being annexed, and that led to a lot of conflict, which he was very unhappy about because to this day, India and Pakistan still have lots of problems when it comes to that divide that he was really unhappy about. But charisma there was utilized. He utilized that for moving his country into a period of an independence or moving them out of colonial rule by the British into being independent, which was seen as important as identifying India as a independent state. Now, this gentleman with the shades down here, anybody recognizes him? I put him there because he's infamous, actually. All right, so that's the Reverend Right Jim Jones. Anybody recognizes that name?
The name sound familiar.
All right, so Jim Jones was a pastor, a reverend, the doctor Jim Jones, who led a sect of people and um, was being
Oh yeah,
persecuted.
that's only the cult.
Right, yes. Who were in Guyana and led his people there to drink Kool-Aid and kill themselves, right? There have been lots of films about him and what he did and how it works, how he did it. And again, he was able to attract a lot of intelligent people, not just some run-of-the-mill, kind of poorly educated individuals, but highly educated individuals who became his followers, highly qualified people became his followers, and he was able to, through the use of his charisma and the fact that he was preaching, he kind of piggybacked a bit on the civil rights movement as well. So he had a lot of Black Americans following him in his movement because they saw this movement as one of moving the agenda of the Black Americans into thing and kind of indoctrinated them into this thinking and was able to at the time he felt he was being threatened by the CIA coming into Guyana to get him and whatnot. And he then, enacted that suicide pact with his people, and they all died. The women, children, men, everybody. It's really weird. You might be familiar with another more recent guy, David Koresh. Anybody heard about him and the Branch Davidians? Anybody knows about him? Rampo? See your mic open.
So excuse, that gentleman is Jim Jones?
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Right. So I was asking whether or not anybody is familiar with the character or a similar cult leader like this called David Koresh.
So if you describe the situation, I might know the
Waco,
situation.
Texas. Waco, Texas, where uh, they were
He has
held.
long hair. He has long hair and he acted like Jesus. Something like
Yes, he
yeah.
saw himself as a Messiah, and he got all these
What's
people
his name?
to David Koresh. And
David.
the name of his movement was the Branch Davidians. Um, and he was supposedly the second coming of Christ and or the Messiah to lead people into the promised land. And um, he was able to manipulate a lot of people into that belief structure. And in a part of his belief structure, there was, he was the only person who was good enough to bring children into the world. So everybody who came into his cult had to give up access to they couldn't be with their wives anymore. and all the female children and everything. It was really sick. So when the FBI and the ATF went in, they kind of lost control of the situation, and they ended up having this really bad outcome where they ended up the place caught fire, and it was carried on live on TV, and that was the horrible part of it. Place caught fire, and a lot of Branch Davidians burnt to death in the camps and stuff like that. It was really, really horrible. But again, it speaks to this whole charisma and the problem of charismatic leadership. Right? And we'll come back to it in a little bit when we look at the theory of charismatic leadership. All right. There's not one right way to lead. So different well, there are different ways in which people might approach leadership based upon how they were brought up. Um, the kind of culture that they lived in and their experience. What also shapes the way in which leadership works is the context in which the leadership is going to take place. So again, we talked about the classroom versus a social movement. So for example, you can't have a, this is one of the reasons why people who are successful leaders in one environment may not necessarily be a good leader in a different type of environment. So therein lies a bit of a problem because techniques that are utilized for leadership in one approach or one circumstance will not work well in another circumstance, and that is one of the reasons why there's not just one way to do things, as per the myth that we're talking about. All right. So there's multiple ways to try and get things done, and it's usually influenced by the person's background, their upbringing, their value systems, as well as the context or the circumstances under which they're acting in leadership. All right, the importance of distinguishing between management and leadership. Remember, we said, or the assumption is, or the myth is, that you cannot be a manager and a leader. Well, there are distinctions between management and leadership. First off, management is primarily responsible for achieving the goals of an organization. So, therefore, a lot of their actions and activities are going to be operational in nature, which and even organizational in nature, which is really about how do I manage the resources that are available, including the human resources, to be able to maximize the output of the organization in order to make the largest amount of profits. Leadership, on the other hand, is the nature of how you go about doing that with the people that you're dealing with. So the leadership element is a different part of that management structure. And the issue that happens here is that whereas a manager is bound by the organizational goals, leaders may not necessarily have that boundary put in place that or have that linkage. And managers here are preoccupied with doing things the right way, whereas leaders are focused on doing the right thing. Now, this is something that comes up a lot. A lot of management focuses on increasing output, increasing revenue, but they're doing that in the absence of looking at whether or not what they're doing is actually better for society or for the people that are involved. Now, so consider, for example, Amazon. Amazon is a company that its managers are working towards making sure that they make the most amount of sales on a regular basis and have increasing sales over the time frame. Now that's what the manager is doing, but how they go about doing it is kind of important, because what happens is if we were to say, okay, well, workers need to have a fair shake in terms of how they're expected to perform and operate in the organization, they have to get a fair wage, then you're looking at a leader focusing on doing the right thing, but a manager is focused on doing things the way in which the organization has designed efficiency. So therein you can see the conflict. So yes, you can be management and leadership can intertwine. There's an overlap between the two, and that's what the whole thing is about. There are distinctions between management and leadership, but there's a massive overlap between the two. And what generally tends to happen is that people who act in a better from a better leadership position are oftentimes being able to get better output and managerial tasks completed because they are able to motivate people to do things they would probably not necessarily be willing to do to begin with. So that the quality of your leadership is is as important as your ability to create managerial tasks. Um, and the relationship between the two is going to be important, especially if your organization is not only focused on money making, but also on the impact it has on society and the people who operate in the organization. That's something that we have to look at as well in terms of social responsibility. We spoke about that in the past in chapter one. All right, next thing, leadership is teachable. So this course wouldn't exist if it wasn't assumed that leadership is a teachable skill. And the fact of the matter is that leadership is not a one and done. It's something that has to be going on over and over again as you start to work on something, try it again, do it over, try again, do it over, and become better and better at what you're doing. So it's not a matter of it just being common sense. It is a matter of trial and error. It's a matter about learning from doing, and it's a matter about trying to find out on your own, learning of other people's approaches and looking at the experience of the other people. So that you don't necessarily make the mistakes that other people made in other situations. So we want to learn a little vicariously from looking at other people, but we also want to learn from doing on our own. But we want to avoid making critical errors or dangerous errors that took place in the past, so we don't repeat those things again. Um, Difficult to do sometimes because sometimes we have to actually make the mistake to learn from it. But the whole point about it is that leadership is not common sense. It requires a lot of other skills that we will be looking at when we look at in chapter 3, when we start to look at the relational model and develop it, and start to realize that there are a whole host of different things that we have to pay attention to there. All right. So let's look at that at the origin of the concept of leadership. And this is interesting. So historically here now, we're looking at leadership is a term, or the word leader can be traced in the English language to about the 1300s. And the word leadership emerged in the 1800s and was used in the context of political influence. So you see a kind of narrow focus here in terms of leadership. There were very few formal definitions of leadership um, after the 1800s up until 1929, and we're going to see some significant things about this here. By the 1980s, we had, at least from Ross and others here, 110 definitions of leadership created by academic scholarly material, 221 definitions found in books and other scholarship publications, and at least 366 publications on leadership that did not include formal definitions of the term. They just spoke about leadership from a very general perspective. So there are a whole host of of work that's been done without clearly defining what they thought leadership was. And that is something that still plagues us today, because leadership is this very vague activity that some people see and others don't. Josiah, you having trouble? Your microphone's open, by the way. Josiah, your microphone's open. Okay, all right. All right, so Earlier definitions or early definitions by Mumford in 1906, 1907 define leadership as the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of controlling societal phenomenon. So this definition here by Mumford is what I call the puppet master definition. This is these shadowy figures who are portrayed as controlling individuals from, some background situations and manipulating people to do things the way they want them to do. This actually speaks to even more. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with this whole concept of Machiavellian. Um, the Machiavellian idea of leadership and how leaders become kings and that kind of stuff. You're familiar with that? By chance?
No, sir.
You know, never came across that terminology of Machiavellian thoughts. Okay, what happened there? All right. So Machiavellian is a very if you want to look it up, you could actually see it. It's a weird or not weird really. It was a book that was written by oh, I can't remember the guy's name now, but he wrote a book for Prince Machiavelli to teach him how to go about leading, being a political leader, and a lot of it had to do with um, sleight of hand manipulation of individuals. If you want to kind of, and it kind of became a favored approach in political struggles. That you showed one thing to everybody, but you did something else behind closed doors. So it's very a kind of nefarious type of thing, and it kind of fits with um, Mumford's version here, where it's a few people who control everybody else through a process of manipulation, and that's probably one of the 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 well, I have to say, most nefarious types of definitions that comes up when it comes to leadership, similar to what Mumford has dealt with here. So it only looked at, and what was inherent in this type of definition was that the people who were doing the manipulating, the leaders at this point in time, were doing were manipulating people to do things for the benefit of that particular group, but not necessarily for the benefit of the individuals and the society at large. So it was what would benefit this the few as opposed to the others. So we kind of see some repetition of that in current thinking as well too, huh? Where we have this whole conspiracy theory and new world order where you have a few people making you're familiar with those conspiracy theories, right? We have a um what do you call them, where they're so unfamiliar with the terminology that they use, but you have like the cabals that exist in society where you have these very rich and powerful people who are making decisions behind closed doors that are influencing. You're familiar with that, right?
Bourgeoisie.
Sorry?
So there's the bourgeoisie. There's like the bourgeoisie and the
Correct.
common
And the
political.
1%ers and that kind of stuff, yeah?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So that's what we're talking about. The super rich and the uber rich, they're the ones who are making the decisions, and they are trying to reorder society in a way that would keep them in their position of power and wealth, and everybody else could go to hell. Basically. All right. Now, newer definitions or contemporary definitions of
I know. There's like the different classes.
yes, and class warfare and that type of stuff comes up in relation to that. All right, so contemporary definitions of leadership like what we've looked at so far in terms of defining the relational leadership model, really speaks to the relational process that exists between the individuals in charge and the individuals who are participating. And in fact, there's a the modern definitions really look at the quality of the interaction between leaders and followers who have to work together to get things done. So basically, we've gone from the nefarious people behind the scene controlling things, that particular definition, to contemporary definitions where we have more of us working together to get things done kind of situation, which is what the more contemporary definitions are like now. And we could see this at work around us, because in most modern organizations you find leadership isn't just, well, those who engage in modern leadership techniques, they don't just simply hand out and hand down decisions to the rank and file to just do. They kind of engage with people and they speak to them about, well, this is what we'd like to do. We want your input here. We'd like to get you to do so and so. So there's a whole set of convincing and motivation and goes into decision-making process, especially large decisions, as organizations make changes and as they move from one type of behavior to another, or one area to another, or as they make grand changes to their structure and whatnot. They generally have to utilize a collaborative approach to getting those things. Now, these modern definitions utilize a lot of the development that we spoke about before in chapter 1 and the introduction, where we talked about they call upon the thinking and the values and the philosophies developed through anthropology, psychology, sociology, history, the arts, and philosophy. Those interdisciplinary, the thinking and philosophy development there have been utilized in methods to be able to um, design and bring about better, more inclusive types of thinking in terms of the leadership models. We are also going to be looking at how they were utilized in the creation of the various leadership theories that we're going to be approaching or looking at in this section of the course here. So today we know that there is not just one correct definition of leadership, because leadership is different to everybody and is viewed differently by other people. And we went through that whole thing. And therefore, deciding which one fits is based upon the context and the situation and the individuals concerned. All right. Now, that then leads us, as I said before, in terms of the contributions from these fields of study to the development of these particular methods of trying to um, um, define leadership through metaphors. So what's a metaphor? A metaphor is a comparison that's not fully stated. We know about this, right? Did this in English, as opposed to a simile, right? That is a comparison using as or like. So if we look at these 8 metaphors here, I'll take a few of them. Like the competitive market metaphor really refers to leadership in the form of competition, and the strongest firm survives. The one that is able to produce at the lowest cost and sell at the most competitive price will be the one that dominates the market. The consensus metaphor on the other side of that is where leadership is defined as the ability to get everybody's opinions and shape them in such a way that you get a general consensus of everybody to be able to get things done and lead from that particular aspect. The democratic metaphor is leadership is seen as the ability of you being able to get the most amount of voting support to get it done. Similarly with collective bargaining is the organization with the greatest number of representatives that gives it the most amount of strength will become the leaders in that organization and that structure. So these metaphors are what they tried to utilize as a way in which to define what leadership is. So one that I found very interesting and I like to utilize here is looking at the metaphor of using music. So how many of you all here like music or can play an instrument and that type of stuff? Think about music from this context here, from this vision. This is an orchestra, not something that we're very familiar with at this time frame, but you probably familiar with a setup that looks more like this one. Not necessarily with a big jazz bass, but think about a soca band. You have about 5 or 6 people down at the back of the thing, and you have a singer in front. And the metaphor here is the band leader. So if we look at that jazz band situation, the band leader must choose the music, find the right musicians, and then perform in public. But the effect of the performance depends upon a lot of things, the environment. And when we say the environment, we're talking about the actual venue, the 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 sound systems that they're going to be utilizing, the makeup of the stage, the comfort of the place, the people, the volunteers that are playing in the band, because again, unless they're paying to be to paid to be in the band, even if they're paid to be in the band or they get remunerated for it, they still have to volunteer and want to perform. The need for everybody to perform individually at their best, but also at their best within a group. And this is something that is problematic because far too often you have situations where in a group you have a very outstanding player, but because they're unable to work within the group, they're not necessarily the best fit for it. So I found that to happen a lot in music in particular. You have very talented people, but their attitude or their way, they're unable to work within groups easily. And it creates a lot of tension and a lot of problems. And of course, here the absolute dependence of the leader on the members of the band. Because if the leader is dependent upon them to kind of play properly, to do things well. So this comparison here, or this metaphor, is probably one of the clearest that has been utilized to try to describe what leadership is like. I mean, anybody here is a musician or plays music in one form or another, or goes to shows and looks at performers, things like that? No? Yes? Maybe? No? How many of you think about this as a soca band? You have a
Yeah, like pan. Yeah, that's what.
sorry, pan? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
going to see it, not playing.
Right. Even when you go to see it, Nyla, well, your hand went up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I've been in a couple choirs that had a live orchestra.
Right. And even a choir, even if the voices, sorry, the band is made up only of voices because you could do a cappella acts, right? You still have somebody who has to conduct everything and get everybody to blend their voices together to make the chords and make the notes and the melody and so on. Not so? Yes, Nyla?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the whole point about it is that it's a struggle for everybody to work with each other. But when it's done and it's done well, everybody appreciates it, even the performers themselves, because they know they did a good job. But at the end of the day, it takes a lot of give and take, and it's not just one person working towards it, it's everybody working together with a common objective of putting out the best performance. And that is something that's important. And the Leon, I think you were talking about a pan side. It's the same thing. Each instrument that you see on the screen here is represented by a different type of pan that exists. Besides the drums and the percussion, which in a pan side you have a drum, percussion, congas, the Iron Man, and all the people who holding on the rhythm section. You still have bass pans, you have tenor pans, um, you have guitar pans that give you the sort of saxophone guitar type things. You have cello pans, you have double seconds, you have double tenors, you have single tenors. You have a whole host of different voices inside there that again require a lot of leadership and a lot of cooperation between all of the segments that make up the pan side to be able to perform in unison. I mean, when you look at a panorama performance, it really is uh, a fantastic thing to hear, that people have been able to, over a short period of time, take a song, break it down, arrange it, and then teach all the parts to everybody, and then get everybody together to perform as one. Is, I mean, fantastic type of activity that's going on here. And I mean, of course, it's better to listen to it live rather than, listening to it recorded, because I mean, the human ear is so much more dynamic than speakers. So I mean, it's something that you can't miss. The beauty of that sound. And like anything else, listening to something live, a live performance, is so much more different to listening to it on televised performances or recorded performances. It's chalk and cheese, that kind of situation. All right. So we talked about this whole jazz metaphor as a metaphor for defining what leadership is going to be. And this jazz metaphor is probably one of the strongest metaphors that I've come across, and spoke most to me because it's easy for me to see, because I do play music and I have played in bands in the past, and I understand from an internal thing how really important it is for leadership to work in a particular way to motivate individuals to do the best that they can. Because at the end of the day, the band is only as good as their least talented player. And their least talented player can be brought up into better performances by the people surrounding them. Another comparison or metaphor that we can utilize is a sports team. The sports team is only as good as their weakest member. Um, so if you have really powerful players in your team, but they're not willing to work with each other and work under particularly the leader, then you're not going to have a successful team. All right. So that's something for you to think about in terms of a metaphor and comparison. So um, another metaphor is that leadership is an episodic affair. Now, what does that mean? It means that leadership takes place in episodes. We don't exercise leadership all the time. We take, basically what they're saying is that leadership is an action that you're involved with in the workplace or in an organization, probably maybe 10% of the time. All the other times you're probably engaged in routine work. As a manager, it'll be operational duties, those types of things. When you conduct a meeting, that may be a place where you're utilizing leadership specific skills. If you're disciplining somebody who you're working with, that might be a combination of operational and leadership. If you're motivating people and trying to get them to do something, that's leadership. But it means that leadership doesn't take place in all one big long set of activities. It takes place in little episodes all the way through your day, all the way through your lifetime. Not everything that you do is about being a leader at the moment. All right. So that episodic type of leadership is something that you could look at in terms of another metaphor for defining what leadership is. Leadership is done in stops and starts and that kind of stuff. That's the kind of thing that they're talking about there. Um, all right. So people do leadership episodically. 10 minutes here, half an hour there, 15 minutes now, and that kind of stuff. That's the kind of leadership metaphor that they're looking at here. So it's not constantly you're the leader. That'll be exhausting if you had to be a leader every second of every minute that you're in an organization. Sometimes you just want to have fun, chat with people, be a bit of an idiot with your staff members and with people you work with, because part of working with people is having fun as well. It's not all about work. All right. So general leadership theories. Leadership is complex, and it's a phenomenon that's not easily described or explained. It's multidisciplinary in nature, and therefore it is, as it says here, leadership adds to its contextual richness and reinforces the metaphor of leadership as an art form. So yes, this is where a lot of people talk about the art of being a leader. And those are kind of things that we want to pay attention to, that Leadership is not only is we try to treat it as a science, but there's an art to doing it, and that's the human aspect of it that we have to pay attention to. When leadership was examined by social behaviorists, it was discovered that leadership has many properties and many forms. So that's going to be another element that we have to pay attention to. That's from Van Fleet. Um, Leadership was once thought of as a relatively simple construct, but now it is recognized as a very complex social phenomenon. And despite the criticisms and its shortcomings, the field of leadership studies has been characterized by a lot of robust and respectable intellectual history. And that's what we're going to get into next, which is the leadership theories that we're going to be looking at here. So these are all the theories that we're going to spend the rest of the evening looking at. So, but before we do that, I'd like to take a break at this point in time and give you a chance to take a stretch, a little walk around, whatnot, before we start to look at these various theories, because this will take us off to the end of the presentation. Would that be okay with everybody? Take a, let's say it's 3:09, let's say 3:10. Let's be back by 3:20, 3:25. That'll be fine.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna pause the recording now, and then we can all take a break.